So welcome to our convocation this afternoon. Our scripture reading for today will be from Romans 12, verses 9 through 13. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal. Be ardent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in affliction and persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints and pursue hospitality to strangers. Will you join me in prayer? God of grace and the giver of life, we approach you with gratitude and praise for this extraordinary community in which we continue to learn from one another and enjoy the many talents and gifts of those around us. It is our privilege to live where we hold one another in mutual affection, where we honor our beloved neighbors, rejoice with them in hope, as we engage in hospitality for the friend and for the stranger. May we always remember we are your people, and in serving one another, we serve you. We're grateful this afternoon to have with us Mark Eaton, who will share his professional endeavors of research, writing, and teaching of American literature. We pray in your name, God of creation. Amen. Amen. Our convocation hymn today is number 686, God of Our Life, and thanks to Judy Ballinger for her music accompaniment today. We'll remain seated to sing the hymn. It's a privilege to have Professor Mark Eaton speak to us today about his new book, Historical Fiction Now. This is a book he co-edited with Bruce Holsinger of the University of Virginia. Some of you know Mark, but many of us know his lovely wife, Victoria. Victoria coordinates our wellness center and gently encourages us to be fit in body and spirit. And we appreciate her greatly as well. Historical Fiction Now brings together prominent authors, historians, and literary critics to explore historical fiction in the 21st century. Mark Eaton has a chapter in the book about alternate history novels, such as The Plot Against America by Philip Roth. Dr. Eaton is professor of English at Azusa Pacific University and an associate research professor of American literature at Claremont Graduate University. He is author of Religion and American Literature since 1950. Since 2015, he's been editor-in-chief of the journal Christianity and Literature, published by Johns Hopkins University Press, and available on Project MUSE. He and his wife, Victoria, live in South Pasadena, and they have two sons, Andrew and Elliot. And I've heard tell of a beloved puppy in the family. So welcome, Mark, and welcome, Victoria. And is this Elliot? Hello, Elliot. Glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me to Monte Vista Grove Homes. I know many of you. I'm a Whitworth University alum, so we have a lot of Whitworthians or connections to Whitworth here. And yeah, just thanks to Terry McGonigal for inviting me, and to Barbara for organizing and introducing me, and to Victoria, who is my wife and also my publicist, and she's helped with a lot of the book events and whatnot. So as Barbara mentioned, I wrote this book a couple years ago, Religion and American Literature since 1950. And so that's a monograph that I wrote about writers in the United States and how they write about Christianity and religion and spirituality. But what I really want to talk to you guys about today is this brand new book that I've brought out called Historical Fiction Now. And so I have copies here that I can actually just pass these around, maybe, if we want to. So yeah, this has been an amazing project to work on. I'm so glad to have it out in the world. It was published in late 2023, so it came out in November. It feels like it hasn't been out that long. This project did get its start right here in Pasadena at the Huntington Library. So there was a conference at the Huntington Library on historical fiction, and I was one of the presenters along with other people from all over the world, really. And so it was out of that conference that we had the idea of putting together a book. And here, several years later, is the book in the reading room at the Huntington Library. So I feel like it's kind of come, it's come full circle from starting at the Huntington to ending up at the Huntington. So I'm going to kind of keep it hopefully light and pretty entertaining, but hopefully you'll come away with a little bit of knowledge too. So here is sort of my working definition of historical fiction. It's a genre of imaginative literature that is set in the past, whose authors make a deliberate effort to convey settings, cultures, and actual historical figures with accuracy, plausibility, and depth. So to be historical fiction, you really do have to have this deliberate attempt by the author to write about the past and to do so pretty accurately, okay? So historical fiction tends to be very well researched, and it does teach us about the past, but we can't forget that imaginative part. It does sometimes embellish or invent, but then it also tries to get it right in lots of ways as well. So it's a little bit of a tricky genre, but one that I think can teach us a lot about history. So one of the things my co-editor says, Bruce Holsinger, is that we can't really have historical fiction without a historical sensibility, which is to say that people need to understand the difference between fiction and history in order to understand historical fiction, if that makes sense. Because we have to be able to say that the author deliberately fictionalized facts, but also that the author knew the difference between fictionalizing facts and representing them directly or straight up, if that makes sense. So this historical sensibility is what I would say is kind of a requirement for historical fiction, which is one of the ways of saying that historical fiction doesn't go back forever. It goes back to Sir Walter Scott is seen as the kind of originator of historical fiction. And then in the United States, it was James Fenimore Cooper who is credited with starting historical fiction. But what my book is looking at is historical fiction now. So we're bringing together novelists and historians and literary critics to explore the genre of historical fiction in the 21st century. So all of the writers in this book there's only one who's now deceased, but they're all working and writing about historical fiction, and they are writing historical fiction. And so what we're trying to do in the book is to ask a pretty simple question: what does historical fiction now in the 21st century look like? What is the current landscape of historical fiction? And so some of the takeaways from the book, I can just go through these kind of quickly, but how does historical fiction now compared to historical fiction then? And so a couple things I would say is that today's writers are really transforming the genre in a lot of ways. So one thing they're doing is that they're elevating the genre of historical fiction from what was long considered a kind of primarily popular genre to the high cultural category of literary fiction. So it's popular fiction, but now very much like literary fiction. Today's writers are also uncovering less well-known individuals and episodes from the past. Today's writers are writing more imaginatively and speculatively about history, so including the genre of alternate history novels, which is what I write about in the book, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then I think today's writers, too, are revising what we thought we knew about the past, and this is in keeping with the revisionism that we see among many historians today as well. And finally, I think today's writers are producing some of the greatest historical fiction that has ever been written. So today's writers compare with Tolstoy and Dickens and some of the greats in historical fiction. So what I'll do now is try to walk you through the structure of the book. This is a brief table of contents, and you'll see that we've kind of structured the book into 4 different sections. But then I'll mainly kind of tell you about all the different writers that I have that have contributed to this book and what their novels are that they're talking about in these essays. So the essays in the book are really all just very lively and interesting essays. You can read any of them just on their own. Some are much shorter than others, but they're all pretty short and digestible and just really fun and lively. So we do have an afterword in the book by the late Hilary Mantel. So she died not too long ago, but after she wrote this essay for my book, which was great. And then I also have a number of novelists in the book, and I'll show you who these people are later, so maybe I don't need to continue with this list here. But in addition to writers, novelists, I also have several literary critics like myself, because I don't write fiction, and then also two very eminent historians who have contributed to this book. So some of the accolades of these contributors, two different writers have won the Man Booker Prize for literature. One has won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. Another has won the National Book Award for nonfiction. Another writer was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So among the contributors to this book are many, many best-selling writers and award-winning writers. So here are some of the writers. I'm going to show you guys some pictures. There's too much text and it's pretty small up here. So I'm going to show you guys a lot of pictures of the authors and kind of talk about the different essays in this book. I thought that might be fun and useful. So the first chapter, chapter 1, is by this writer, George Saunders. He has taught for many years at Syracuse University. He is primarily known as a short story writer, but he did write one novel so far in his career, and that novel was this one, called Lincoln in the Bardo. Some of you may have read this novel. It's about Abraham Lincoln. It's about his wife and his son, Willie, who died, as some of you may know. And it's sort of about how Lincoln and his wife sort of dealt with the grief of the loss of their son. And so the chapter by George Saunders is called Ghosts in a Graveyard, and it's basically about, you know, kind of what was it like to write this novel about Lincoln and grief. So that's one chapter in the book. Another chapter is by the writer Sophie Colombo, who is a literary critic and a professor in the UK. And she is writing in this book about Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall trilogy, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. I have another writer in the book named David Ebershoff. David Ebershoff is a Pasadena native. He grew up here. He went to Polytechnic High School, and he's gone on to become a novelist and also a editor at Random House. Many of you know Ron White. David Ebershoff was Ron White's editor for many years. But as a novelist, he wrote this novel called The Danish Girl. And the essay in my book is about writing this novel, The Danish Girl, okay, which is historical fiction. As I go through the list of writers, I'm going to kind of just note which ones have been adapted to film. And so this one, The Danish Girl, was made into a movie in 2015, and starring Eddie Redmayne and Alicia Vikander. So that's David Ebershoff's. And then Michael Lackey is a writer, a literary critic that I knew I wanted to have in this book because he writes about what he calls biographical fiction. So this is what we might say is a subgenre of historical fiction, but it's about one particular person, a historical person. So if the whole novel is about one person, that would be kind of a biographical novel. Not a biography, but a novel about a person, okay? So that's a kind of subgenre of historical fiction that Michael Lackey writes about. I also have this writer, Catherine Howe, and she is a historical fiction writer, and she's written 2 books about the Salem witch trials called the Physic Book of Deliverance Dane. So this is one. And then her next book is The Daughters of Temperance Hobbs. And so that's Catherine Howe. let me go back to her because I have a little short anecdote that I'd like to tell about Catherine Howe. So my son Elliot, who's here, is a student at Cornell University, and he was taking this class with a historian that he really liked, and he told me this historian's name, and so I just Googled him and looked him up online, and it says online that he's married to the novelist Catherine Howe. And I said to Elliot, like, oh, this teacher that you have, his wife is in my book. And so Elliot went up to talk to him, the professor, and said, yeah, I think your wife is in my dad's book. And he said, oh yeah, she's really glad to be a part of that book. So that's a kind of 6 degrees of separation anecdote that I really like. Okay, so I was very pleased when I asked this woman, Taya Miles, to be in the book. Taya Miles is a very distinguished historian at Harvard University, and she has won multiple prizes for her books. And she also, though, wrote a novel which is called The Cherokee Rose. So let me show you a picture of that novel. So The Cherokee Rose is a novel that is about the South, and it's about slavery. But it's a book that came out in 2015, but then Random House wanted to republish it and come out with a new edition in 2023. And so Taya Miles asked me if she could use her essay, her chapter from my book as the foreword to this new edition of the novel. So I think that's pretty cool too. Another writer who some of you all may know and may have read is Geraldine Brooks. She's a pretty prominent historical fiction writer, and she wrote, for example, that novel about the plague called Year of Wonders, which was, I think, a fantastic novel. But interestingly, for some of you all, biblical scholars, the book that she writes about in historical fiction now is a novel that she wrote about King David in the Bible. And so this essay, the novel is called The Secret Chord, and it's about David. And so Geraldine Brooks kind of writes in this essay about, how did I find out about David? He's obviously talked about in the Bible, but there's otherwise not a lot is known about him. And so what she describes is that she went to the places where David lived and tried to sort of immerse herself in that culture in order to get a sense of what his life would have been like. So again, that's a novel about the life of David. Another writer who's definitely kind of up and coming is Namwali Serpell. And this is a writer who writes fiction, but also writes literary criticism. And she's a professor at Harvard as well. And she wrote this incredible novel called The Old Drift in 2019. And it's about Zambia, where she's originally from. And it's specifically about the Zambian space program and its founder, Edward Mukuka Nikasolo. And so I have a couple photographs of Mukasolo here. So the novel is kind of a fictionalization of Zambia and the history of Zambia, but then specifically it gets into this space program that was developed in Zambia. And that's the cover of Namwali Serpell's novel, The Old Drift, from 2019. So there's another chapter this is the Bruce Holsinger, who is the co-editor of this book, and he is a professor at University of Virginia. He's a medieval literature scholar by training, but then he started writing historical fiction about the Middle Ages. And so he's a kind of well-known scholar of historical fiction, but also a writer of historical fiction. And I'll tell a real quick story about his chapter, which is that when he was writing his first novel about, let me go back to him. I'll go back to the picture. Whoops. Yeah, so here he is, Bruce. When he was writing his first historical fiction novel, The editor, it was set in the 1200s, and the editor at the press came to him and said, well, you can't use Your Majesty to refer to the king because it wasn't used until the 1400s or something. But Bruce, being a scholar of the Middle Ages and a historian, he went to the archives and found out that, sure enough, Your Majesty was used in the 1200s all the time. And so he said, well, actually, it's fine to use that. And the publisher said, okay, fine, you're right, but you still can't use it because there was this book that said what you can and can't do as a historical fiction writer, and that was one of the things that they said. And so everybody will think it's wrong, even though it's not wrong. So that was kind of what he writes about in this essay called Historical Fiction and the Fine Art of Error. I asked my friend Gavin Jones, who is the department chair of English up at Stanford University, to contribute, or I asked him if he had anything to contribute, and he's working a lot on the short story, so he decided to write a kind of chapter for the book on what does it mean to write historical fiction in the short story rather than the novel. How is that different? So this is a really interesting, I think, chapter. It's a little bit of an outlier in the book because he looks at John Steinbeck, a short story by John Steinbeck, who is not really contemporary, but it's an interesting essay that talks about historical fiction, world building, and the short story. So I'm moving right along. Let's see, where are we? I think I'm doing great in terms of timing. The next writer I want to share with you is Maaza Mengiste, and she lives in New York, and she teaches at, I believe, one of the SUNY schools, creative writing. But she wrote quite an incredible novel called The Shadow King, which was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize in 2019. This is a novel about women in Ethiopia who fought in the war in the 1930s against Italy. And so she specifically, this is the novel here, The Shadow King. And so she specifically wrote about this woman named Hirut. This is a photograph of Hirut. And she wrote about her experiences fighting, as I said, for Ethiopia against Italy, the invading force in the 1930s. So this is another photograph that she uses in the book of these women soldiers. So quite a remarkable novel. So the chapter that, here I am, the chapter that I wrote for this book is one that I felt like we should include some attention to the subgenre of historical fiction that's called alternate history novels. And so our alternate history novels are, you're probably familiar with these, they're novels in which, let's say, the South wins the Civil War, or Germany and Japan win in World War II. And so it's a counterfactual kind of fiction that asks, what would have happened, if such and such, if John F. Kennedy hadn't been assassinated? So I'm looking at this genre and trying to, talk about what kind of historical fiction is this? What do we learn about history from these novels that are, in a lot of ways, telling it like it wasn't? The Man in the High Castle is one example by Philip Dick. So that's an earlier example. There are earlier ones than that too, but then I focus quite a bit on this novel by Philip Roth called The Plot Against America, which is about Charles Lindbergh, the great American aviator, was running for president against Roosevelt. So the novel imagines what happens if Charles Lindbergh wins the presidency. So that's a really interesting example. And then The Underground Railroad I sort of include by Colson Whitehead, not so much as an alternate history novel, but as a kind of counterfactual novel, because it imagines some things that didn't really happen or didn't happen in that specific time frame. But he's kind of, mixing up and playing with history. And so that's kind of what my chapter is about. All three of these, by the way, have been made into movies. The Plot Against America, a TV series, I should say. The Plot Against America, The Man in the High Castle, and The Underground Railroad have all been made into TV series, which are well worth watching. So the writer Thea Obrecht is pretty well known as the author of The Tiger's Wife, but in historical fiction now, she's actually writing an essay about her novel Inland. And this is a novel about the American West. It's from 2019, and it's about how some of the settlers in the American West actually brought camels to the American West. And so that's actually something that evidently happened. And who knew that there were camels in the American West? But this is what that novel is about. This writer, Jessie Burton, is another one of several writers in the book from the UK. And so she writes, she's based in London, and she's a novelist. And her essay is one of my favorites in this book. But then her writing is also just really impressive. This is her novel, The Miniaturist, which was a New York Times bestseller. It was a UK Times bestseller, and it was made into this miniseries in 2017 starring Anya Taylor-Joy. So that book is called The Miniaturist. So this is Jane Kamensky, and Jane Kamensky is a historian. And she has been at Harvard University for a really long time, but I read just 2 weeks ago that she is moving to Charlottesville, Virginia to become the director of the Monticello, so Thomas Jefferson's house in Monticello. But Jane Kamensky actually wrote a novel along with her colleague Jill Lepore. And this novel that they wrote is set in Boston in 1764, and it's called Blind Spot. And so it's really interesting to look at this novel because it's two prominent historians trying to write historical fiction. And they're sort of reflecting on, what is that like to write fiction about the past as opposed to what we normally do, which is to write history. And so just a couple of more, I think. This is Naomi J. Williams. She's a California writer, and she teaches at the University of California, Davis. And she wrote a novel called Landfalls, which is about the La Perouse expedition, something I did not know about. It was a French voyage of exploration led by Jean-François de Galloup de La Perouse. And so she found out about this expedition from a map that she discovered, and then she, she proceeded to kind of research into this, and the result was this novel Landfalls, which is quite remarkable. So it's about a French expedition in the 18th century. I added this writer, Kirsten Chen, who has a chapter in my book called Am I Chinese Enough to Tell This Story? So she's a Chinese-American writer who writes about Chinese history in this novel, Bury What We Cannot Take, from 2018. And then I'm going to end now with the writer Hilary Mantel, who wrote an afterword for my book. And her afterword is called I Met a Man Who Wasn't There. And so this is an essay in which she talks about her writing the Wolf Hall novels. And all of these novels are about Thomas Cromwell, who becomes Henry VIII's sort of right-hand man. And she, is approaching Thomas Cromwell as a novelist, not as a biographer or as a historian. And so she kind of reflects on, well, what can I bring to the table? How can I interpret and represent this man, this historical figure who is a very important person in Tudor history, and how can I kind of recreate his life in literary fiction. And these novels are masterpieces of historical fiction. Wolf Hall won the Man Booker Prize. The second novel in the trilogy, Bring Up the Bodies, also won the Man Booker Prize. And then the third novel in the trilogy, The Mirror and the Light, was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, but lost out to another novel, I forget which one. So all three of these books are, as I say, kind of tracking the life of Thomas Cromwell. And Hilary Mantel has actually donated all of her papers to the Huntington Library. Here she is, a photograph of her at the Huntington in the archives, examining Cromwell's signature on a document. And the woman there also in the photo is Mary Robertson. Mary Robertson is a historian and a librarian. She's worked at the Huntington Library for many years, and she is a scholar of Thomas Cromwell. All three of these novels are dedicated to Mary Robertson. So that relationship with our very own Huntington librarian, Mary Robertson, was really important to Hilary Mantel. So I'll say a little bit more about the novels themselves, but I want to point out that these were made into a BBC TV miniseries that was excellent, starring Claire Foy as Anne Boleyn and Mark Rylance as Thomas Cromwell. And so I think I may have time to just show you guys a little clip from this movie. Will we have sound through the, we may have sound, okay? Let's just try it. I'm just gonna skip forward a little bit. Hopefully this isn't too loud. I'm gonna skip forward a little bit.
I suppose it's some sort of test after I'm released.
So
Test.
this is a conversation between Anne Boleyn, played by Claire Foy, and
I want to see my brother.
Thomas Cromwell,
It's a foolish demand in the circumstances.
played by Mark Rylance.
My father.
Oh, don't expect help there. Thomas Boleyn looks after himself, first and last. I should know he's my brother.
Help the king. Unless he's merciful, there's nothing you can do for yourself. But you can do something for your daughter, for Elizabeth. The more penitent you show yourself through this whole process.
The process. And what is this process to be?
The confessions of the gentlemen are now being compiled.
What?
You heard him. They'll not lie for you.
The gentlemen are to be tried together. You and your brother, being ennobled, are to be judged by your peers.
You have no witnesses.
When you were at liberty, madam, your ladies were intimidated by you, forced to lie for you. Now they are emboldened.
I'm sure they are. The way Seymour's emboldened. Tell her from me, God sees her tricks. No. Just tell me. You don't believe these stories against me, do you? I know in your heart you don't. Do you, Cromwell? I only have a little neck. So it'll be the work of a moment.
Okay, great. So yeah, maybe we should turn the lights back on. So wonderful scene there, and I should mention that Hilary Mantel in the novels kind of recreates that scene from a letter that was sent by the jailer to Thomas Cromwell, talking about how Anne Boleyn had made this comment about, I only have a little neck, so the execution will be quick and painless. And so what's interesting about that is that Hilary Mantel uses that letter to create this scene, but she can't resist putting Cromwell himself there. So in the letter, of course, it's the jailer reporting it to Cromwell, but in the book and also in the movie, she decides to have Cromwell be in conversation with Anne Boleyn and have her reveal that. So it makes it more dramatic. It makes it less factually true, but this is an example of something that historical fiction does, is that it embellishes, it dramatizes, it sometimes changes the actual facts, and that's okay. So to just conclude, one of the things that Hilary Mantel says here about historical fiction is that it's meant to get inside the heads of the characters also. So whereas historians really have to say kind of objective and external, historical fiction writers can really move in to people's minds, and they can try to understand their thoughts. Do we really have access to their thoughts? Well, sort of. But if we're familiar with the historical figure that we're writing about and about the period, we can kind of recreate this interior life of these figures. So she compares it to painting. Good historical fiction is self-conscious, like a painting where the brushstrokes are visible. And she kind of, you might compare it to the famous painting of Thomas Cromwell by Hans Holbein here. You see this painting, it's in the Frick collection in New York, and she talks about this very painting in the novel, and she also includes the painter Hans Holbein as a character in the novel. So that's kind of an interesting point of comparison. The other thing she's looking at is, of course, biographies of Cromwell, but she says that you can read all the biographies and still not get a sense of what it was like to be Cromwell. And so that's where she says, is this where a novelist can kind of get inside his brain and kind of recreate the experience of history, what it was like to live through this period? And so that's what she tries to do. There's a biography of Cromwell by Dear Maid McCullough, and who is a dear friend of Hilary Mantel's, and you may be able to see it, that she has a little blurb on this biography. But she says, I thought about Cromwell, and I thought about what I could do as a novelist, and I thought maybe as a novelist I can kind of create a Cromwell that people don't really know. So this is a illustration of Hilary Mantel. That's meant to look like a Holbein painting. It's by the illustrator Marco Ventura. So we sort of wanted to use this image on the cover. The book is not just about Hilary Mantel, obviously, it's about historical fiction. So in the end, we decided not to use this. The publisher also thought it might be a little cheeky to use this image of her. And so that ends my presentation. I think we may have time for a few questions. Thank you so much for listening.
This was marvelous.
Thank you.
One of my undergraduate majors was history, so this is just like candy. Thank you. This is wonderful. I'm getting your book.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you.
I do have a question of something you just said.
Yes.
The value of the fiction is getting inside the heads of these people. But then you said, as a little aside, even though the history it may change the history.
Yes.
What does that do to the reader's sense of the history, and how important is that?
So what I think about this is that, first of all, yes, I think interiority and the interior life is one of the things that historical fiction brings to its representation of history. And that's, you know, it is embellished. We're sort of imagining what people thought, but it still can be very revealing. And what I would say is this, that, you know, when you're living history, you sort of don't know what's coming. You don't know what the future holds necessarily. And so I think that's what fiction does, is it puts us in the present tense as history is unfolding. And so we're inside this perspective of this character who is trying to navigate, you know, these tricky political plots and, you know, stuff that's going on. And he's trying to navigate that, and he doesn't quite know what's going to happen. So what was it like to live with that uncertainty, with the kind of ominous feeling that, you know, something bad was going to happen? Does that make sense? So what I would say is that fiction brings this kind of experience of living through history, as opposed to just trying to represent it objectively from our retrospective, you know, perspective. Does that make sense? Yeah.
The last part of that,
Yes.
the importance of, say, when they change the history.
Yes.
How important is that for the reader to understand?
Well, I understand what you're saying, is that there is a risk or a danger of, you know, embellishing too much and maybe getting the history wrong, or like maybe getting Cromwell wrong. But I guess, you know, there is some element of interpretation that historians do as well, right? Obviously. So yeah, I think there is a danger of kind of historical fiction maybe not getting it right, but I think that concern is a little overblown. Like, I think that people always go to that. What about, you know, what if, you know, historical fiction is, you know, not getting it right, and therefore we're learning the wrong history or something? But I think instead we need to see it not as a liability of historical fiction, but as one of its strengths, is that it is able to imagine and maybe speculate a little bit and to bring us inside these characters' heads, and that's what it brings to the table, and that's what it lives on, is being able to kind of imagine the past, and that gives it a kind of liberty that historians don't have. So that's what I would say. Yes.
I'm intrigued by the authors who are primarily historians.
Yes.
But also have written historical fiction.
Yes.
So what is the distinction in how they treat facts?
Yeah. Yes. So Jane Kametsky's chapter is about that very thing. And so what she does in her essay about that is she says, when I'm writing history, I have to be somewhat careful not to speculate about something that we can't know. You know, I have to really base it on, you know, the facts, the archival sources that we have. You know, historians will very rarely, if ever, create dialogue, for example, of what people said, because we can't really know for sure what they were saying, right? So that's one of the differences. She says that, you know, it's kind of fun to kind of imagine these characters, to imagine what they're wearing, to imagine what they were saying to each other. And all of that is kind of invented, but it is based on this pretty deep knowledge of the historical period and what did people wear and, you know, how did they talk. One of the things that's remarkable about Hilary Mantel's novels is that she says somewhere in an interview that I tried not to put too much in Cromwell's mouth in the dialogue that I didn't find somewhere from letters or journals or, so she really is quite, I think these writers are actually quite scrupulous about getting the history right, but at the same time they are, having Cromwell say something in an intimate conversation with his wife. They're having a dialogue, and we don't have access to that, right, from the historical documents. So I think that's the main thing, is the historians have to go on the archives and the documents, but the novelist can sort of imagine what was happening.
Dr. Eaton, I just want to say that you're talking to a room where half the folks in here have a deep respect for the historical record upon which they base their teaching and preaching, and yet, to bring that imaginative sense that brings the texts,
for sure,
the historical text, to life in a new way for the folks who are reading, there might be kind of a Venn diagram between historical fiction writers and preachers who like scripture and history. I'm just wondering out loud.
No, I like that question. If I could just say something real quickly, that some of you know my father, Philip Eaton, and I just talked to him the other day. He's teaching a class at his church. My parents are in Scottsdale now, and he's teaching a class on how to read the Bible. And so we had this conversation where I was like, well, how do you teach the Bible? How do you read the Bible? And how to read the Bible? And he says, I read it as literature, So that's his approach. But then others are kind of looking at, the historical context, et cetera. But I appreciate that comment.
Yes, my question is regarding the Danish Girl.
Yes.
I plan to show it here during Pride Month.
Yeah.
And so is that a good choice?
I think so. I think it's a pretty remarkable novel, and it's about the first woman who was trans, right?
And underwent the
and underwent
gender
a surgery,
gender
reassignment surgery. Yes.
So that part is historical.
Yes.
But some of the dialogue and all would be fiction.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
But it was really a woman. I think her name was
yes,
Alba.
I have her name in the slide.
I have it too, yeah.
Yeah.
So you think it's a pretty good choice?
I do. I think it's a very tasteful movie, and it won Academy Awards.
Yeah, for Best Supporting Actress.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
I really admire the director of that movie, too, Tom Hooper. Yeah.
I did hear, though, that Rittman, who played the leading role of the trans woman, said that if he were asked to play that role today, would say no.
I see.
Because he feels that a trans person should play it.
Well, that's an
That
interesting
makes sense.
point. Yeah.
This is more comment than a question. I'm so appreciative of this.
Yeah.
In my first life, I was a high school English teacher.
Great.
And I remember telling my students, I'm not sure the history teachers liked it, but I told my students to really understand an era. One of your best avenues is well-researched. Now, that was the caveat. Well-researched historical fiction. Because
absolutely.
there are I had a lot of students who would rather eat nails than read a history book. But they're going to be interested in something like this.
That's interesting. Yeah, I appreciate that. And they do say that there have been studies that show that reading literature for students, younger people, it does kind of help them become more empathetic, whereas reading, nonfiction does not have the same result. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I know the mic's gone, but I also I just can't help but help us think about the fact that there's no such thing as truly objective history.
Well, this is true. Yeah, that's a whole debate as well.
And that's why many of us, women, have grown up. I did a seminar on women in American history, and I heard about all kinds of really significant women that no one taught me about.
Sure. Yeah.
And I'm sure
Yeah.
Catherine has the same experience.
Yeah. One of the reasons I'm interested in historical fiction is because I was trained as a literature person and I'm an English professor, but I'm also kind of a historian. You know, I've always kind of wanted a PhD in history as well. And so I decided to become, you know, as knowledgeable as I could in history, in American history as well. So I sort of teach American literature as history, if you will.
I want to thank you for this. I think that imagination is one of the most important traits to foster among students.
Yes.
And I wish I could take your courses. Thank you for that. I've thought a lot about, as I've heard you talk about a colleague, he's a biblical theologian, named Walter Brueggemann.
Oh, sure,
and
yeah. I've read him.
Well, he writes a lot about imagination and prophetic imagination, and
for sure.
I think there's an intersection with what you're doing and what Walter has done with prophetic imagination.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, for sure. Yeah, and those kind of overlaps between literature and theology, and I find those really, really interesting, yeah.
Well, I salute you.
Okay, great.
And I also think you married well.
I know. No, believe me, I know that. She's the best.
So do we reserve the final applause for Victoria or for Mark or for both of you? Can we please show our appreciation? We are so very grateful. Thank you, Mark. Well, next week we turn the calendar to May, so let me just give you a little bit of a highlight of what is coming. As you know, this is our centennial year here at the Grove, and we've themed this year, We Shall Remember, the importance of probing our past to understand where we are in the present. And so during the month of May, we're going to lean into some history and some storytelling. And the way we're going to do that is in 3 parts. Next week, you'll get a chance to meet a good friend of mine, Lenore Three-Star. Lenore lives in Spokane. She's a member of the Evangelical Covenant Church, speaks nationally about the doctrine of discovery. And what Lenore has done is gone back and researched the theological foundations of the doctrines that led to the first exploration that led to colonization. I can't tell you how much I respect this dear woman. I was in a reading group with her. We met every month for years. And all that I will say is it changes the conversation when you're in her living room and you look up and then a picture on the wall is of her grandma who survived Wounded Knee. And now we're into a deep conversation very quickly. So Lenore's going to help us think about the theological roots of the doctrine of discovery that led to so much of the tragedy of the last several hundred years in this country, particularly in relationship to indigenous peoples. Then on May 23rd, we're going to hear the story of the local indigenous tribe, the Tongva, Mona Recalde, who speaks quite often about this in the area. I know some of you have already heard Mona speak about this, is going to give us a sense of this land, this place, San Gabriel Valley, in relationship to that particular tribe. And then in the last Thursday, Liz Cheadle and Tom Durf, on behalf of the Diversity Committee, have gone back and have actually researched the history of this particular plat of land on which Monte Vista Grove resides. And so we're going to take sort of a 3-part approach to understanding where we are in 2024 from the perspective of history over those 3 weeks. On May 9th, we're going to get a chance to hear from our dear friend Dale and hear about his commentary on Romans. So thank you, Dale, for that. And on the 16th, we're going to hear from a good friend of Barb and Jim Matthew, David Domke, who's been involved in voting rights efforts here in the United States for 20, 25, 30 years, long history of the importance of the power of the vote and registering people to vote. So there's the lineup for May for Convocation. We're thrilled that you are involved, and Mark, thank you for being flexible in a very busy week, which is finals week out at APU. Mark couldn't make it yesterday because you were giving a final, and so we've called you in for a review today, and we are very grateful for your presentation. Let's please show our appreciation again to Mark. Thanks to all of you for being here.